When we talk about emotional dynamics where betrayal has occurred, one of the first and most important shifts happens inside the empathic individual, the moment they begin to withdraw emotional fuel after being deeply hurt. This withdrawal is not immediate revenge, and it is not a calculated strategy. It is a natural nervous system response combined with growing emotional clarity. It happens when the inner world of a deeply feeling person reaches a point where continued engagement no longer feels safe, sustainable, or aligned. For a long time before this moment of withdrawal, there may have been a pattern of over-understanding. The empath often tries to see beyond behavior, to interpret intention, to hold space for complexity. Even when something feels wrong, there is often an internal dialogue that seeks explanation rather than exit. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe there is context I don't see. Maybe I should be more patient. This internal process can extend the life of unhealthy dynamics far longer than they should naturally continue. But betrayal changes the internal equation. It introduces a rupture that the empath cannot easily integrate into their previous understanding of the relationship. It is not just the act itself, it is the emotional contradiction it creates. The place that once felt safe now feels uncertain. The person who once felt familiar now feels inconsistent. And that inconsistency creates cognitive and emotional strain. At first, the empath may still attempt repair. They may still try to communicate. They may still try to restore balance because their default setting is often connection rather than disconnection. However, something subtle begins to shift beneath the surface. Each attempt to reconnect feels heavier. Each effort to understand feels more draining. Each emotional investment feels less returned. And this is where the withdrawal of emotional fuel begins. Emotional fuel is not just attention, it is engagement, responsiveness, emotional availability, interpretation, forgiveness, and energy directed toward maintaining the bond. When an empath gives this consistently, it can hold even a very unstable dynamic together. It creates continuity, even when reciprocity is lacking. But after betrayal, that continuity starts to fracture. The empath begins to notice something they may have overlooked before, how much of the emotional labor they were carrying alone. How often they were the ones making sense of things, initiating repair, or smoothing over tension. And once awareness enters, energy naturally begins to shift inward rather than outward. This shift is not loud. There is no dramatic announcement inside the mind. It is more like a gradual turning down of a system that once ran constantly in the background. The urge to respond immediately begins to slow. The impulse to explain everything starts to weaken. The need to emotionally process the other person's behavior begins to lose urgency. And in that slowing down, something very important happens. Space is created. Space where emotional dependency once existed. Space where reactive cycles once operated. Space where automatic engagement once flowed. Without that constant emotional input, the dynamic starts to lose one of its foundational supports. Because many imbalanced relationships do not rely on mutual stability, they rely on one person consistently supplying emotional energy to keep things functioning. When that supply is reduced, the structure does not immediately collapse, but it does begin to destabilize. From the outside, this withdrawal may not look dramatic. The empath may still appear calm, composed, even understanding, but internally, they are no longer feeding the cycle in the same way. They are no longer over-investing in repair. They are no longer emotionally overextending to maintain connection. This is where the true significance lies, because emotional systems that depend on constant engagement begin to weaken when that engagement is no longer freely given. What once felt easy to sustain now requires effort from both sides, and if that effort is not reciprocated, the imbalance becomes increasingly visible. For the empath, this stage often brings an unexpected clarity. They begin to see the difference between connection and dependency, between mutual exchange and emotional extraction, between genuine care and one-sided emotional labor. And with that clarity, the internal motivation shifts again. It is no longer about fixing what is broken at any cost. It becomes about preserving what remains of their emotional well-being. This is the quiet power of withdrawal. It is not about punishment or control. It is about rebalancing a system that had leaned too far in one direction for too long. As the emotional fuel is gradually removed, the empath begins to return to themselves. Their energy, once directed outward in constant interpretation and repair, begins to stabilize internally. Their thoughts become less consumed by the dynamic. Their emotional state becomes less reactive. Their sense of identity becomes less entangled in the outcome of the relationship, and in that space of reduced emotional output, something profound begins to emerge: self-preservation without guilt. They begin to understand that not every emotional connection requires continuous maintenance from one side, that not every bond deserves unlimited access to their emotional world, that stepping back is not abandonment of care, it is recognition of imbalance. This realization marks the beginning of a deeper transformation, because once emotional fuel is no longer freely and endlessly given after betrayal, the entire dynamic must adjust or dissolve. And either outcome leads to the same truth becoming visible: the empath is no longer operating on automatic emotional investment. They are choosing awareness, they are choosing restraint, and most importantly, they are choosing themselves. Now expand the second keynote with no subbotting in detail. Output in 700 words. When we look at the aftermath of betrayal within an emotionally imbalanced dynamic, one of the most critical shifts that occurs is the loss of the emotional supply system. This is not a physical system, but a psychological and emotional structure built through repeated patterns of attention, reaction, validation, conflict, repair, and reconnection. It is a cycle that often runs silently in the background of the relationship, sustaining it even when it is deeply unstable. In many such dynamics, emotional supply does not simply mean admiration or affection. It includes something far more complex: emotional responsiveness. The willingness to engage, to interpret, to forgive, to explain, to re-enter dialogue after rupture. When one person consistently provides this level of emotional engagement, they become the stabilizing force of the system, even if they are the one being harmed in the process. Before betrayal is fully acknowledged, this system often remains intact because the empathic individual continues to participate in it. They may feel hurt, confused, or even depleted, but they still engage. They still respond. They still try to repair what feels broken. In doing so, they unknowingly keep the emotional structure alive. But betrayal introduces a rupture that changes the internal math. Something shifts in the empath's perception. The emotional cost of participation begins to outweigh the instinct to repair. What once felt like connection starts to feel like depletion. And slowly, the automatic flow of emotional supply begins to reduce. At first, this reduction is subtle. Is the empath may still respond, but less immediately. They may still care, but with less emotional urgency. They may still engage, but without the same depth of investment. It is not detachment in the cold sense. It is the beginning of energetic reallocation. And this is where the emotional supply system begins to weaken, because these dynamics are not sustained by one dramatic event. They are sustained by repetition, by cycles of engagement and re-engagement, by the predictable return of emotional availability after disruption. When that predictability is interrupted, the system loses stability. The other side of the dynamic often depends, consciously or unconsciously, on this emotional return. The expectation is not always articulated, but it is reinforced over time that after conflict there will be repair, after distance there will be reconnection, after silence there will be re-engagement. This expectation creates a rhythm that keeps the system functioning. But when the empath begins to withdraw from that rhythm, the structure destabilizes. There is no longer consistent emotional reinforcement. There is no longer guaranteed re-entry into the cycle. The familiar loop of rupture and repair begins to break. And in that breaking, something becomes very noticeable. The emotional system no longer regulates itself as it once did. What used to feel smooth now feels unpredictable. What used to resolve quickly now lingers. What used to return to baseline now remains unresolved. This is not simply discomfort, it is the loss of emotional regulation within the dynamic. For the empath, this stage often brings a growing sense of clarity. They begin to recognize how much of the emotional structure depended on their participation, how often they were the ones restoring balance, how frequently they were the emotional stabilizer without equal support in return. And once this awareness forms, the emotional supply naturally decreases further. Not out of punishment, but out of exhaustion and truth. Because when you see the structure clearly, you can no longer participate in it unconsciously. As the supply diminishes, the system begins to experience what it was never designed to function without: absence of emotional continuity. The gaps become more visible, the silences feel longer, the instability becomes harder to mask. Attempts may be made to restore the previous rhythm, to reintroduce familiarity, to provoke engagement. to reestablish the cycle that once felt predictable. But what is often overlooked is that the empath is no longer operating from the same internal place. The emotional reflex that once fueled immediate repair is no longer automatic. Instead, there is observation, there is pause, there is discernment, and this shift changes everything because emotional supply systems depend not just on access, but on willingness. And when willingness decreases, access becomes irrelevant. The empath begins to reclaim their emotional energy, not dramatically, but gradually, not with force, but with awareness. They begin to invest less in what drains them and more in what stabilizes them. Their emotional world starts to reorganize itself around balance rather than obligation. And in that reorganization, the old system cannot fully sustain itself. It may attempt to persist. It may try to recreate familiar cycles. It may seek to reestablish emotional engagement in subtle or direct ways. But without consistent participation from both sides, the structure weakens over time. What once felt like an unbreakable loop begins to lose coherence. And what replaces it is space. Space that was once filled with emotional reaction. Space that was once filled with repair attempts. Space that was once filled with imbalance disguised as connection. For the empath, this space becomes transformative because it allows something that was previously unavailable, emotional neutrality. Not indifference, not suppression, but clarity without compulsion. They are no longer required to feed the system to maintain stability. They are no longer bound to cycles that deplete them. They are no longer trapped in emotional rhythms that do not serve mutual growth. And in that realization, the loss of emotional supply is no longer experienced as emptiness. It becomes liberation, because what has ended is not just a cycle of interaction, it is a dependency structure that required imbalance to survive. And when that structure dissolves, what remains is something far more stable, the return to self-regulated emotional strength, quiet, steady, and no longer available for systems that cannot hold reciprocity. Now expand the third keynote with no subbing in detail, output in 700 words. When we examine what happens after betrayal within an emotionally imbalanced relationship, one of the most defining shifts is the breakdown of control, not in an obvious confrontational sense, but in a subtle psychological sense where predictability, influence, and emotional responsiveness begin to disappear. This is what it means when control starts to break without reaction or repair. It is not about one person losing power over another in a dramatic way. It is about the gradual loss of emotional leverage that once kept the system stable. In many such dynamics, control is not maintained through direct authority or force. It is maintained through emotional patterns, predictable responses, familiar cycles, the expectation that certain behaviors will lead to certain emotional outcomes. When one person becomes consistently emotionally available, responsive, and engaged, the system begins to rely on that predictability. Before betrayal is fully processed, this predictability often remains intact. Even in moments of conflict or distance, there is usually an underlying assumption that repair will happen. That engagement will resume. That emotional access will be restored. This assumption creates a sense of stability, even if the relationship itself is unstable. However, betrayal disrupts this entire structure, because betrayal does not just affect trust, it affects expectation. It creates uncertainty where there was once predictability. It introduces doubt into what was previously automatic. And most importantly, it begins to change the emotional responses of the empathic individual. At first, the empath may still attempt to maintain balance. They may still try to communicate, to understand, to restore connection. But something subtle begins to shift. Their reactions are no longer immediate. Their emotional availability is no longer automatic. Their responses begin to carry hesitation, reflection, and emotional distance. This is where control begins to weaken, because control in such dynamics depends heavily on emotional predictability. When responses can no longer be reliably anticipated, the structure begins to lose its grip. The familiar rhythm of action and reaction starts to dissolve. And without reaction, there is no reinforcement. This is a critical point. Many imbalanced systems are reinforced through emotional reaction. Even conflict can serve as reinforcement because it maintains engagement. It keeps the emotional system active. It confirms that the connection still exists, even in distress. But when reaction is reduced or removed, the system no longer receives the same reinforcement signals. And this is where something unexpected happens. The absence of reaction begins to replace reaction itself. Silence becomes the new variable. Not emotional silence as punishment, but emotional non-participation as a form of regulation. For the empath, this often emerges gradually. They may not consciously decide to withdraw control from the dynamic. Instead, they begin to notice the cost of reacting, the emotional exhaustion, the imbalance, the repetition of cycles that lead back to the same place without resolution, and slowly they begin to pause. That pause is powerful, because in that pause, automatic control mechanisms stop functioning as they once did. The ability to predict their response becomes weaker, the ability to rely on emotional patterns becomes uncertain, and what once felt manageable through repetition becomes unstable. This is where the system begins to shift. Attempts may be made to reintroduce familiarity, to provoke emotional engagement, to restart the old cycle of reaction and repair. But something has changed in the empath's internal landscape. The emotional reflex that once guaranteed response is no longer as strong. There is now space between trigger and response, and in that space, control loses its foundation. Because control requires immediacy, it requires predictability, it requires emotional participation that follows familiar patterns. Without those elements, the structure begins to dissolve. For the empath, this stage is often accompanied by increased awareness. They begin to see the pattern rather than just feel it. They begin to recognize the cycles they were part of. They begin to understand how often their reactions sustained dynamics that did not serve their well-being. And with that awareness comes change, not dramatic change, but internal recalibration. They begin to respond differently, not necessarily with confrontation, but with delay, with observation, with emotional restraint. They begin to choose when and how to engage rather than reacting automatically. And this choice is where control truly begins to break. Because once emotional responses are no longer predictable, the dynamic can no longer rely on them as a stabilizing force. What once felt like influence begins to feel uncertain. What once felt like access begins to feel inconsistent. What once felt like emotional structure begins to feel unstable. And in that instability, something becomes clear. Control was never truly about one person dominating another. It was about the predictability of emotional exchange. When that predictability dissolves, the entire framework must adjust. For the empath, this often leads to a deeper realization that their emotional responses have value, that their reactions are not obligations, that their engagement is not automatic currency for maintaining connection, and this realization creates a new internal boundary, a boundary that does not need to be spoken loudly to be effective. Because silence, when intentional, carries its own structure. Distance, when consistent, carries its own clarity. And reduced reaction, when maintained, carries its own form of strength. Over time, the dynamic that once depended on emotional predictability begins to lose coherence. Attempts to restore the old patterns may continue, but they no longer produce the same outcomes. The emotional feedback loop becomes inconsistent. The system no longer stabilizes through reaction. And what replaces it is something entirely different. A relationship to self that is no longer defined by automatic emotional participation. A space where response is chosen, not triggered. A state where engagement is intentional, not reactive. And in that state, control as it once existed no longer applies, because what has changed is not just behavior, it is awareness. And once awareness enters the system, predictability can never fully return to what it once was. Now expand the fourth keynote with no subading in detail. Output in 700 words. When we reach the stage where the mask can no longer be maintained consistently, we are observing one of the most revealing consequences of emotional withdrawal and betrayal dynamics. This is not about a literal mask in a physical sense, but about the psychological construction people maintain in relationships, the curated self, the controlled image, the version of behavior that depends on external emotional feedback to remain stable. In many emotionally imbalanced dynamics, this mask is not simply deception. It is a survival structure. It is built through repetition, reinforcement, and the presence of an emotional system that responds in predictable ways. When someone receives consistent emotional engagement, especially from a highly empathetic individual, they begin to rely on that engagement as a stabilizing force for their own behavior. The image they project is often sustained by the reactions they receive. Before betrayal disrupts the system, this structure can appear relatively stable. The empathic individual may interpret the behavior through the lens of trust, hope, or emotional investment. They may continue to respond in ways that reinforce connection, even when inconsistencies appear. In doing so, they unknowingly contribute to the maintenance of the external emotional mask. However, once betrayal occurs and the empath begins to withdraw emotional fuel, something fundamental changes in the system. The external reinforcement that once supported the constructed image begins to weaken, because masks are not self-sustaining. They require feedback loops. They require emotional reflection. They require engagement that validates the constructed identity. When that validation is no longer consistently available, the structure begins to destabilize. At first, this destabilization is not immediately obvious. There may still be attempts to maintain consistency. Familiar behaviors may continue. Old patterns may be repeated, but the emotional environment has changed. The empath is no longer participating in the same way. Their responses are no longer predictable. Their engagement is no longer automatic, and this shift removes a critical stabilizing force. Without consistent emotional reinforcement, inconsistencies begin to emerge. What was once carefully managed may start to slip. What was once controlled may become harder to maintain. Emotional reactions may become less filtered. Behavioral patterns may become less aligned with the previously maintained image. This is where the mask begins to show strain. It is important to understand that this is not necessarily intentional collapse. It is the natural result of a system losing its supporting structure. When emotional feedback is reduced or removed, the energy required to maintain a curated version of self increases dramatically. Over time, sustaining that version becomes increasingly difficult. For the empath, this stage often brings clarity, because without the emotional intensity of constant engagement, they begin to observe more than they react. They begin to notice inconsistencies that were previously overlooked. They begin to see patterns rather than isolated events. And this observational state reduces their participation in reinforcing the external image. This reduction in reinforcement is crucial, because what maintains a mask is not just the person wearing it, it is also the emotional environment that supports it. When the empath stops over-engaging, stops over-explaining, stops over-investing emotionally in maintaining connection, the system loses one of its key stabilizers. And in that loss, authenticity begins to surface, not necessarily in a positive or negative sense, but in a more unfiltered way. This can manifest as confusion within the dynamic. The familiar responses are no longer guaranteed. Emotional reactions may not produce the same predictable outcomes. Attempts to restore previous engagement patterns may not yield the same emotional feedback. The system becomes less reliable, and unreliability is the beginning of exposure, because a mask depends on consistency. It depends on the expectation that certain behaviors will be met with certain responses. When that expectation is no longer met, the structure begins to lose coherence. For the empath, this often marks a turning point in perception. They begin to understand that what they were interacting with was not a fully stable or integrated emotional presence, but a constructed version maintained through interaction. And when their interaction changes, the construction itself begins to change. This realization is not always immediate. It often develops gradually as emotional distance increases, as silence becomes more present, as reaction becomes less automatic, as engagement becomes more selective. And in that gradual shift, the mask loses its consistency. It may still appear at times, it may still function in certain moments, but it no longer holds steady across all interactions. The emotional continuity that once made it believable begins to fracture. For the empath, this creates an important internal shift. They are no longer responding to the surface presentation in the same way. They are no longer emotionally investing in maintaining coherence where it no longer exists. They are no longer supplying the energy required to uphold a constructed image. Instead, they begin to disengage from the illusion of stability. And in that disengagement, something powerful happens. Clarity replaces confusion. Because once you stop emotionally reinforcing a mask, you begin to see what remains without it, not necessarily as a judgment, but as understanding. This is where emotional reality begins to separate from emotional performance. And as that separation grows, the mask can no longer maintain its consistency. It may still appear in fragments, in moments, in selective interactions, but it is no longer the dominant structure of the dynamic. For the empath, this stage represents not just observation of change in the other person, but transformation within themselves. They are no longer participating in sustaining appearances at their own emotional cost. They are no longer reinforcing inconsistency through over-engagement. They are no longer responsible for maintaining emotional coherence that does not belong equally to both sides. And in that realization, a deeper form of emotional independence begins to form. Because when the mask can no longer be maintained consistently, what is revealed is not just the instability of the dynamic, but the strength of stepping back from what required constant emotional maintenance to exist.